Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Amrine. Welcome to the USC Supply Chain Technology and Innovation Panel. I'm from Startup Junkie. We're a leading entrepreneurial support organization. I also run Cadron Capital Partners. What we're going to do to get things started is I'll turn it over to each of the outstanding panelists we have. They'll give you about a minute introduction, and then we'll get into some very specific questions that hopefully will be of interest to the audience as it relates to supply chain technology and innovation. So to kick us off, Andre, how about introducing yourself?
Oh, thanks very much, Jeff. Well, my name's Andre Simha. I'm the Chief Digital and Information Officer of MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company, one of the largest container carriers today. Yeah, my focus is on helping steer the business towards the digital future of the shipping and logistics sector. A lot of focus on innovation, of course, digitalization, looking at industry standards and trying to understand how technology can really help us to move forward together with the industry partners. I've been very active for many years, even though I'm in Switzerland. In the US, I was on the board of Intra, the e-business portal, for about 14 to 15 years. Today, I'm also the chairman of the Digital Container Shipping Association, where we're trying to create standards and, again, trying to bring the industry together for a better future.
Andre, that's great. Thank you very much. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Brian Reed. I'm a VP at Geodis in our supply chain optimization team. And we focus on 4PL solutions in the supply chain optimization group. But as you know, Geodis is a much larger logistics organization working with partners around the world, much like Andre's organization on the ocean container side. And I focus on different aspects of our business, but working with our customers to find new solutions and how to outsource different parts of their supply chain and how we can bring innovation and technology to support them.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sasha.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Sasha Bayer, co-founder and CRO for Clockwork Logistics Systems. So my background is really, I spent half of my career roughly with 3PLs, two global 3PLs. Eventually decided to venture into that beautiful technology and startup world. Of course, learning a few new tricks. So what we do essentially is we deploy an extension solution to digitize the pre and post carriage in the global supply chain. Our team certainly understands the business, and we also believe that it's truly a solution that is globally scalable. Our customer base ranges from the typical BCO, global BCO, to 3PLs, some of the largest in the world, and we're obviously going to help them on the journey of digitization in that space. So thanks for having me again. Really a pleasure to be here on this panel.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Mike?
Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff, and really excited about today's discussion. At Plug and Play, we're named one of the largest accelerators in the world, also one of the most active early stage investors or venture capital firms and startups. We make over 200 investments a year into different startup companies. Today, we've invested in over 10 companies valued over $1 billion, like Dropbox, PayPal, Lending Club. We had a recent exit actually from Southern California in Honey, which is a coupon platform that was bought for $4 billion from PayPal. So we're super excited about that. I've been at the firm for over 5 years. I started the supply chain group where we now have offices in Silicon Valley primarily, but also we have an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. We partner with Walmart, Tyson Foods, JB Hunt, and Georgia Pacific. We just announced a new supply chain accelerator office in Toronto, Canada, along with Canada Post and BASF, as well as an office in Europe, in Hamburg, Germany, along with Shell and DB Schenker. So we look globally at startups to invest in them, to accelerate them, and also connect them to our industry partners, including Brian, who's one of our partners from Geodis.
Thanks very much, Mike. Daniel, how about you?
Well, so hello, everyone. Thank you all again for taking the time to join our chat today. My name is Dan. I'm a general manager at Uber Freight, which is Uber's brokerage arm for over-the-road trucking, and I oversee our shipper platform, which is essentially our digital-first self-service platform for typically small, medium-sized shippers. And like Uber, I'm actually also a new entrant into the industry with only about a few years working in freight. but have had quite a bit of journey through tech, working early on at companies like Square and DoorDash. So really excited to be with you all here today.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. Manish?
Hi, everyone. This is Manish Kapoor, and I'm the founder and CEO of two companies. One is Advarix, the other one is Expedel, both with a common mission to help young e-commerce companies scale up fast. Advarix is a consulting company for supply chain and operations. We provide technology as well to young e-commerce companies. And Expedel is a high-tech 3PL, again, focused on companies that don't want to own their own operations. It's like I come from experience at Amazon and FedEx. I was the first person hired when Amazon started building their own home delivery. I helped launch that worldwide, India, China, UK, and the US. Launched Amazon Fresh for Amazon, as well as Sunday delivery. Prior to that, at FedEx, launched a number of same-day delivery services. And so glad to be here. Awesome panel. Looking forward to the discussion today here.
And Manish, while we've got you, we're going to go ahead and start with the first round of questions. And this one I'm going to pose to everyone. But as you look out upon what's going on within supply chain, what would you think would be the two most disruptive technologies that are impacting supply chains today, and why?
Great question. So I tend to think about what are those technologies going to impact or change? Where's the change needed? That naturally lends to which technologies will be effective. So one thing is pretty clear, that e-commerce was ramping up fast. Guess what? After COVID-19, it's like supersonic speed right now. So home delivery, e-commerce is going to continue to ramp up. And the impact of that is twofold. One, if you look at the traditional supply chain, the optimization of the traditional supply chain has to get better. That's one of the two segments. Now that leads to technologies, related to, we have Daniel from Uber here. Big focus is these trucks have been running with open capacity underutilized. So we'll see more and more optimization technologies that are focused on utilizing assets better, so we can improve the unit economics overall for the traditional side of the business. The other end is, if you think about last mile, which is home delivery, that is the most disruptive part of the supply chain as far as e-commerce is concerned. And in that segment, we'll see more innovation. Amazon just got the approval to fly drones and use those for deliveries. FedEx just a few months ago announced using robotics to go to people's homes. And we're actually actively working with GM as well to look at other automation in last mile. So we'll see more automation in last mile, and again, more optimization technologies, machine learning, software-based technologies to improve the utilization of assets.
Fantastic. Daniel, what about you? What do you think? Two most disruptive.
Yeah, so appreciate the call out, Manish. I think from the point of view of a broker, we keep seeing more and more disruptive technologies emerge as a result of building a tech-enabled network, right? Where when you have your entire driver base using mobile apps to book and tender loads, then you're able to layer on, dynamic pricing algorithms, machine learning models, so that all of these drivers can now see the execution price of any load without having to call or negotiate. You're essentially removing tons of different traditional bottlenecks to further innovate within that supply chain. So, for example, as a result of this network, we're able to now bring and guarantee instant quoting to our shippers for any lane for up to 14 days out. And we've actually bundled this into a self-service platform for our smaller shippers to help manage their freight. And this has actually been quite disruptive, as it's basically brought this long tail of hundreds of thousands of typically ignored, untech, small, medium-sized shippers online. And once you get that demand liquidity, you can actually implement a whole host of innovations where we can now not just bundle low volume freight within just one shipper, but we can actually scale that across a number of different small shippers who all have low volume freight to keep the costs low. And I think the second innovation that we're also seeing as a result of these tech-enabled networks is this evolution of a cost-plus model, right? In conjunction or in favor over the traditional RFP process, where especially in the current environment when the market is just incredibly uncertain, being able to dynamically cost out these rates, provide access to instant capacity, have helped reduce the traditional costs of a shipper running some of these formal RFP processes. So we're seeing quite a bit of disruption that's been accelerated just from the basis of having a lot of these tech-enabled networks.
Fantastic. And Mike, given what you do at Plug and Play and the fact that you run that supply chain vertical and see cohorts of companies on a regular basis, what are your top two disrupt? I know that's like picking between your kids, but give it a shot.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jeff. It's really hard to figure out what my favorite are when there's so much opportunity in the market. The supply chain market has changed dramatically because of COVID, and we're actually seeing a lot of opportunities for investment currently in the market that we're really excited about. So very grateful to be in supply chain right now. But just a couple areas that I'll mention. Number one, I would say, is artificial intelligence and the need for robotics and automation. Like when you have things like COVID-19, where you can deliver something more safely with a robot, or de-risk potential contaminations with COVID-19 with a robot rather than human, and you can have more social distancing, for example. Those are huge trends that have been stimulated because of COVID-19. But there's all the technologies in the background where you need IoT sensors to track and the data. You need to clean the data before you can really have like strong artificial intelligence that you can utilize in this supply chain. So those are things that we also connect. And then I'll just quickly, I could talk forever about this question. I know I've limited time, but the last trend I've really noticed recently is hydrogen and clean energy. There's been a huge demand for new kind of renewable energy across the supply chain and trucks and different opportunities. So those are some big things that we've been looking into a lot recently.
That's really good. Sasha, what about you?
Yeah, cool. I mean, I would also think in the areas of heavy disruption, I think drones have to be in there for sure. Not just from a delivery perspective, but even when you look at inventory management, possibly inside the four walls. Robotics also super interesting. But in general, we also believe that there is something that comes, has to come sooner, which is really the digitization of the global supply chain, especially in areas where we just don't access it properly, right? And here we're essentially, and I'm not sure if always everybody understands it, but we're replacing essentially pen and paper. I mean, it's incredible how manual this industry still is. In every aspect of the business. So I think when you come to the point where you can wrap technology around current processes, while at the same time really putting people also first, because I think we're going to be a while from the fact when people will disappear from the supply chain because people touch it every day in all corners of the world. I think then you really have also in that aspect of things some serious disruption, yeah. And of course, from the way we look at it, we also have to wonder sometimes, all these billions of dollars of investments, right? Whether they go into the right places, right? Because a lot of it feels like it's almost like far out, right? It's too far in the distance. While we need help now, global supply chains need help now. So how can we ultimately do that? How can we make that better, create more visibility, and also what we heard, just automate, optimize, AI will come in and all that good stuff, and further down the road, other technologies which, have gone a little bit on the back burner, but are still certainly out there. So that's a bit how we're looking at this thing, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're actually getting some audience questions in the chat, which we'll get to here. I want to be responsive to that group, but I want to give everybody a chance to weigh in on this one. Andre, what about you? What are your top two disruptive technologies?
The good thing is, first of all, I agree with everyone. And I think that, all these new tech, AI, ML, robotics, and things like that are definitely something which are up and coming. But on the other hand, I think Sasha was pointing out that we're in an industry that's, very much paper-based. So I think we need to tackle the problems, one by one. And so I think working on the digitalization of the documentation processes is definitely something we need to do. If I look at the, if I look at the shipping side of things, if I look at the maritime, which is what we're involved in, it's not just about how the information flows within the organization, but how you manage to make it flow throughout the entire supply chain ecosystem. And we're seeing, companies building new digital platforms. And, having gone through Intra, where we tried to bring e-commerce or e-business to the industry, it took us, probably 10 years to start doing very simple things. So, I mean, one of my key topics is definitely IoT. I think that if we look at the, if we look at ships, containers, trucks, rail, the fact that we could, gather information about these assets would give us really a very big potential to improve the visibility, transparency, and essentially the predictability, even without the AI and ML. So I think this is something very important. But of course, to do that, is what I always say is you need standards. So we're working on standards in the maritime side of things. And I think that's going to help us bring better IoT solutions than, of course, using technologies such as blockchain. Nobody said it yet, so we're happy to be the first. I think that's also going to be something which, although it's not new, but new for some, will be very useful once we sort out all our documents and we digitize all that paper.
And you're not supposed to drop the jargon without giving us the wink that that's one of the drinking words we agreed upon.
Absolutely.
So next time blockchain, you go off screen and you got to take a shot of something. But Brian, round us out here. What are the top two disruptive technologies that you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll echo with Andre. I think it's important to understand not just what you can execute, but also what you can understand. And Sasha mentioned this too, right? So if you look at some of these technologies, such as, automation, or even more so in the AI and the ML space, employing those in areas that are going from the paper and pen or pencil straight into digitalization, they might be able to do that actually faster than a big organization, right? Because they don't have all this overhead and this complex ball of yarn that they have to kind of tease apart to put the technology in. But now that they've got the technology in, do they really understand it? And so I think AI and ML have the capability to be a big disruptor, but in those kind of older or newer entrants, I should say, it's going to take a little bit longer. I know it's an area for us, it's a very key spot along with IoT and automation. But I think taking those three together and applying them in a kind of a basic environment is going to be different versus a more complex environment where a lot of us are doing our day-to-day efforts. And I think actually one of the biggest disruptors for supply chain is going to be beyond the supply chain. So if you think about IoT that Andre was talking about, the impacts that can have on insurance can be huge, because now I know exactly where my goods are. I know exactly where they've been. I know if they've been tilted, if they've been shaken, whatever that is. And that can have a follow-on effect on another big component within the business enterprise.
Very good. And so we got a couple of questions, which I'm going to integrate here because I think they're relevant from one of the audience members here. And the question is, so we're seeing all this push towards automation. We're seeing more people working from home. We're obviously seeing the impact that's having on delivery because in-store shopping has been changed. The question is this just an effect of the pandemic, or is this something we're going to see continue? Is this a larger trend that was catalyzed by the pandemic, or is this something that will go back to business as usual after in terms of a higher degree of automation? Whoever wants to take that, raise your hand and you got the first shot at it.
I can start. So I believe some of the habits that we are rapidly changing towards are going to be permanent, and the others will go away. To give you an example, many people were not used to shopping online or even having food delivered at home. It's actually pretty cool when you start doing it. And it's hard to go back to the old habits because it's so much easier now to do that. So I think the push in the ramp up in home delivery and e-commerce is here to stay. And I think part of the question that that we saw from the audience was also talking about social distancing within the four walls and so on. That portion, I believe, because we're still social animals, that the moment we get the freedom to get out of that mode, human beings, we will go back to shaking hands, hugging each other, getting closer together. We just have to be cautious right now. So I think, yeah, those are the two aspects that I see, that the social aspect will come back, but the buying habits of buying online and home delivery are here to stay.
Sounds good. And I think, Andre, you had something you wanted to add to that. I saw you raise your hand. You just missed the bell by a hair there.
I did. No, look, I think that, obviously the COVID situation, I mean, we saw the change, at least in my industry, particularly in our offices. We saw the change because, things that we were using, tools we were using, and, IMs and WhatsApp and all these things, as Zooms and what have yous, which was, relatively common for people on the tech side. I think a lot of the colleagues didn't really understand that. They preferred, to pick up the phone, let's have a meeting. I mean, I used to fly half of my time, and we would go to London I'm in Geneva, we would go to London or to, Paris, Brussels for a 2-hour meeting just, to be face to face. And so I think that part has changed. I think that a lot of people have realized that that when we talk about, digital transformation and all these, do I have to drink on that one too?
We'll
it's not so
that.
much, okay. It's not really about what the technology, does for us, but it's about how do we continue to operate? How do we continue to work in an environment which is, essentially hostile? So coming from the 1980s, I've seen that change, and of course, I think a lot of us have adopted it, but a big part of the people that have not adopted, have sort of plunged into it. And as I think Brian said, getting home deliveries is now something that people find perfectly common. And then I guess some of that is going to stay. Although, again, being European, we miss, kissing and hugging our colleagues. So yeah.
I'll give, there was a follow on there. There was a question where the audience member asked, where have we seen very little innovation in supply chain? And I'll make the commentary here because I know many of you have motor freight experience. The one area that I think is crucial that has to change is within motor freight, the average age of a long haul driver is middle 50s. And the churn rate in most of those motor freight carriers is somewhere between 90 and 150%. Doesn't matter whether freight volumes are up or down, it's a high churn business. So the thing that strikes me is, yes, with autonomous vehicles, maybe you get to the point where that's no longer an issue, but I'd be curious as it relates to innovation, which may not be a technical solution, who wants to take on how we address the driver shortage and driver retention? Who's got some thoughts around that?
Well, we have obviously some ideas here as well, and we just fundamentally believe, that what you stated is right. The average driver has a certain age, right? And eventually there will be new ones coming in. I think that event will happen before we see autonomous driving. And hence, the next wave of drivers is a different caliber. It's possibly an Uber or a Lyft driver. Now, God forbid you give one of these individuals a paper and a pen or a typewriter to make matters worse. They wouldn't even know what to do with it. Right. So I think that's really a point of where we need to look out and provide new technology, let alone obviously of making the job easier and possibly even keeping it safer altogether, right? Because you just have better tools available to do it. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, so we're going to get back to some of the other sort of mega trends that we've seen, or the trends that we've seen that have been caused by the pandemic. And Daniel, I'm going to start off with you on this one. It's what consumer and enterprise behaviors have you seen that have changed during COVID-19 that are driving supply chain innovation? We talked about some of them, but I'm really interested in your perspective.
Yeah, and to echo on a number of folks' points so far, e-commerce has just exploded, right? And we've seen this shift in consumer spending from services to goods. You're seeing an explosion of demand as tenders across shippers have just dramatically risen over the last 2 quarters. And I guess a great tie into the latest point that we're talking about is that the supply base just hasn't been able to keep up, right? The rejection rates are as high as ever, and as a result, the rates are sky high. So when you're seeing this much uncertainty in the market, it just becomes more and more imperative for shippers to access that instant capacity, right? And it kind of builds on top of what we've talked about of having this tech-enabled network where, at least for Uber Freight, we're actually seeing our API business where we've integrated with a number of large TMS players like BlueJay, SAP, and MercuryGate just soaring over the past few months as shippers adopt these new technologies to get a little bit more certainty in their routing guide and looking to technology that can accommodate the high frequency bidding nature of their business. So, once this technology is in place, the shippers begin to realize that there are a ton of ops efficiencies resulting from this type of behavior. And it kind of just moves them further and further away from this ops heavy pen and paper type of work to streamline their supply chains even further.
Got it. Mike, what about you? What are you seeing? Two behaviors in enterprise and consumer during COVID-19 that are driving supply chain innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it touches a lot of the things that were already mentioned, but the elephant in the room is obviously e-commerce is exploding right now. And I believe that e-commerce is a trend that will stay. Like people are going to get accustomed to ordering things on Amazon, or they're just ordering things right to their door. And I think it obviously will die down to some extent, but at the end, I think this is probably a tipping point for e-commerce. Also, I think another big one I mentioned earlier is like safety. It's critical to have safety in your supply chain. How can you ensure that you're not transmitting COVID across different parts of your supply chain, for example? And like digitizing bill of ladings, for example, or digitizing that paperwork, I think right now is more critical than ever. Because if you think about it, there's a business case for it, but then there's also a safety case for it. Because if you're transporting paper for people across the supply chain, then you could transmit COVID, for example, on the piece of paper. So I think that's another big trend that will stay and create more urgency for digital transformation.
That one is really good. This non-standard bill of lading and the fact that you've had legions of hourly employees scanning this stuff in and all the information latency, it only amplifies the issues around COVID now that you're having to handle that paper. So that's really a good call out. Brian, what about you? What are two consumer and enterprise behaviors you've seen that have changed during COVID-19 that are driving supply chain innovation?
Yeah, I think we're seeing what everyone's seeing, right, with the rise in e-commerce. And our U.S. businesses is heavily supporting e-commerce, such as Apple and other people. And I think that I agree it's going to be around. This was just an accelerator. It was already there. It was already accelerating. It just steepened the curve for everyone on how to support it. And I think that consumers get used to that shorter timeline in many instances. I do think that some of it will disappear in the fact that there may be some e-commerce that you're doing today that isn't as fast as it is going to the store. So I know myself, if I need something from Home Depot, I'll probably run down to the Home Depot because I can actually go get it really quick, finish my project right away, versus e-commerce. I have to at least wait hours, if not a day or two, to get it. So I think also bringing in that timeline component is what will make a difference. I think the low touch and no touch is also something in the supply chain that's going to continue to grow. You know, Home Depot just announced today that they're going to start providing no touch lockers at all their stores for pickup. So you don't even have to come to the parking spot to pick it up. There's just a locker you're going to go to. And you see that a lot in apartment buildings and other larger residential areas where instead of UPS going from house to house and spreading the virus potentially or contacting a lot of different locations, they go to one location, can be disinfected very easily in that one location. So I think kind of those no touch and low touch areas that really go back to Mike's point around safety. And I think safety also within the four walls, and I know that we talked a little bit at the very beginning, the safety within the four walls has really been focused around physical safety to begin with, and physical by back hurt, damage and issues that you might be doing and bending and lifting devices. And so I know with Mike and the group at Plug and Play, we've looked at things around exoskeletons. And while I think those are still important and can still provide a benefit, now those same devices can also give me my 6-foot radius measurement. So it makes that business case a little bit easier when you start to pile on these benefits. And so I think we're going to start to see it branch out in some areas. And I think there's some we don't even know yet, right? The startups that are solving our problems are just now forming from COVID. So we probably have at least a 6-month delay until we start to see some of those even more exciting innovations coming out.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, and what comes to mind when you talk about the industrial IoT and the industrial athlete is the work that's being done at Strong Arm Tech, for example. Some of the stuff that they've done that can also be used to make sure that people are maintaining safe distance and not just working safely together. That's really good. So I'm going to ask all of you this next question, and it's near and dear to my heart and all of you because a lot of you have been both large enterprise and startups. But one of the things that we often get concerned about is startups are all desirous to work with Fortune 500s, Fortune 1000s, dancing with the elephants, so to speak. So Andre, starting off with you, what can large enterprise do to work more successfully with supply chain tech startups? What are some thoughts? And I'm going to give everybody a chance to weigh in on this one because I think it's crucially important for competitive advantage of both the large enterprise and the startups.
I think that's a very interesting question, Jeff. And personally, I've always been attracted by startups. I think that you need that sort of you need that freedom to bring innovation, new ideas, and you mustn't be afraid to try things that perhaps we would say, okay, that'll never work. I didn't talk about the digital bill of lading because that's one of my favorite topics. But I think that if you I'm on the board of about 3 startups, and I can tell you it's a hell of a job. Very often what I see is that they tend to have a lot of ideas. They tend not always to have the focus on what brings value to the company that they're working with. That's one of the things that I found to be quite difficult. And but I think that it's the only way to accelerate the deployment, for example, of certain technologies and to make it work for the large enterprise. Things that very often we cannot do internally because of the complexity of the organization. So I think that if you're a startup and you want to do business with us, it's going to be tough, but you need to you really need to push it through.
That's great. Daniel, what's your perspective on that? I mean, given that you spend a lot of time in the startup world, how do you do it without getting crushed by the large enterprise? And what should the large enterprise be thinking about as well to work more effectively with startups?
Yeah, I almost look at the question and try to flip it around, which is like, how can supply chain tech startups work successfully with large enterprises,
Yep.
right? Because as Andre said, there's a ton of eager operators and engineers out there that are just trying to build a ton of products that are being used. And I think it's very important to, just from the very start, work closely with these enterprises to identify actual problems to solve, versus kind of build out solutions and then jump in trying to find different problems to solve. It might not be like a real pressure point for these enterprises. So I think a lot of it is just really working right from the start with one of these partners. I mean, the freight industry is obviously extraordinarily complex, right? So there's a ton of areas and opportunities to innovate. So I think it's really working right from the start with these large enterprises. But if we were to kind of flip that question back, which is how can large enterprises work successfely with supply chain tech startups, to me, it's just keeping an open feedback loop from the very beginning, right? Which is, again, you have these teams, these very scrappy teams with very little overhead that are able to move, quite quickly to ship things. If we can create that feedback loop and have it right from the very start, you can actually build something pretty neat.
That's fantastic. And Manish, you've seen this from all sides. You've been in big operators, as big as they come, and you've been on the startup side of it. So talk about how is it that startups can be enterprise ready, and how is it that enterprises can get the value out of a startup without crushing them?
Yeah, I think Andre hit on the nail when he talked about the small companies, and the startups tend to focus on their own product and what they've built, and less on the impact it's going to have on the customer's business. So I think shifting gears to, hey, what's the value that the startup is offering in their whatever they've come up with, and ultimately it's the financial impact that most large companies are looking for, which seems to be an afterthought. It's pretty natural. Human beings, come up with a great idea, we run with it without taking a pause and thinking, hey, what's the impact and how will it financially help? So that's on the startup side. I think that's the biggest nugget. On the big company side, what I've seen is the culture comes in the way, right? Where you may see a great startup, great solution, but change doesn't come easy because you're so set in your ways. Just the approval processes and the red tape that comes in the way, holds the big companies to move fast. Even large companies like Walmart, I believe that could have been much further ahead in terms of home delivery. Now they're catching up, when Amazon really took everybody to task. Well, I mean, there's no reason for it. The product was already so close to the consumer, but they could have pulled in some startups to help launch that. So it's really hard for large companies to think outside their cultural box and be open to take the risk. I think the trick there is to be able to create a separate channel, separate entity if needed, to open up and pull in those startups to bring the two worlds together.
Perfect. Sasha, what about you? What do you think? How can the large and small, the innovative startups work well with large enterprise?
Yeah, I think what we on the onset should understand is a little bit the makeup of the startup, right? Because we talked about change management, we talked about different cultures, and I would also add in here different languages or language in general, right? And there are incredible startups out there, right? But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, right? The solution design, where do we generate value? What's the ROI? Maybe there's a lack of understanding of the business, yeah? And in that sense, I've certainly been privileged to be in that boat really understand suffering, if you will, from a 3PL or a BCO for that matter. So we have a different way of framing it or understand the problem and how we can solve it for sure. I think that's an area where I would, have maybe an enterprise understand the startup a little bit better beyond just the technology itself, right? Because, the other thing is, 3PLs are also an interesting breed, right? First thing, we always want to talk about cost because we don't understand necessarily the value generators, or we have a hard time to get to them. And if we don't get to them, it becomes too big of a burden, right? And then we naturally disengage. So I would say that. And then lastly, if you do engage, I think we just have to be mindful, right? What can a startup do, not just for an enterprise organization, but for technology deployment in general, right? There's so much in it, right? So if we're being dropped along the lines, or the enterprise loses effort, right? And this is sometimes often what we find, that we don't have enough energy to pull through just with a POC, for example, right? Or we just deal with too much of, well, we always done it that way, it always worked. Well, congratulations to you, right? So I think those are the things that needs to be looked at to make that relationship successful. But other than that, we feel pretty good about the development we had so far. But those are certainly things that, to me, at least stick out when I think about some of the areas where we didn't come to terms, if you will, right? Timing, you also mentioned.
Sure.
I could give you examples, contract negotiations, months in the making. But anyways, we'll leave it at that.
Right.
That's for another day.
Not to cast any aspersions on the lawyers, but the lawyers and the accountants tend to be the deal killers, right? Lots of good innovation dies in the legal department waiting for a contract.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
I'm glad you said it. Thank you.
Brian, weigh in here. And I'm going to add a little bit more context, my own experience. I've been on all sides of this as well. And the thing that always struck me about it is the fact that the startup is impatient. They want to get things done. They want to work with the big company. They don't fully understand the process. They also have fears that the large company will put the brain sucker on them and just take them through a proof of concept and then say, see you later, and do it themselves. Not that happens a lot, but it does happen. So what's your context on it? How can it be this sort of symbiotic relationship between large enterprise and innovative startups?
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. And it was actually one of the two ideas that I would have brought forward, is that you have to find the right collaboration partner, especially as an early stage startup, not just any customer, right? Because you're thinking, I got to find customers. I just got to get whoever I can, right? I just need a customer. I need multiple customers. But sometimes you can have bad customers. As you said, some were there just to drain your brain. Some were there with good intentions. Like Sasha and you mentioned, maybe we'll get hung up in legal or finance or some other area and not actually be successful themselves or ultimately for you. So I think looking for that collaborator, someone that's going to collaborate with you, someone that's going to tell you when you're wrong, someone's going to tell you, ask you the questions like Andre was saying, is who is your customer? You got to know, a lot of these startups that I work with, especially with Mike and the group at Plug and Play, I ask them who their customer is and they don't know. They think it's everyone, and that's not your customer.
Anyone with money, right?
Yeah, you'll be struggling for years. You might get lucky, but
Yeah.
Great technology.
Yeah.
But I think the other is also, once you've kind of found these targets, is knowing how to enter the target. And we get these questions a lot, and I've talked to a lot of analysts about this. You got to know where to go into the organization. Yeah, you can go in the IT group. They're the ones that are going to understand the technology easiest. And you can go in, but they're not necessarily going to understand the business needs, right? They may or may not be as deep in the business needs. Or you can go on the business side. Of course, they're going to know the business needs. They're your ultimate end customer, but they may not really understand your technology. And so I think you need people like what you see on this call, this presentation, and also people that I work with Mike's team at Plug and Play. You need kind of that person in the middle. I always call it the referee or the translator, right? Sometimes they're refereeing between IT and business, and sometimes they're literally translating what sounds like English from one side to the other. So they both really understand, and becomes that glue in the middle. And I think if a company has those, and most larger companies do, those are the people you really need to target. And again, that might even steer you to the type of customer or the type of company that you target. ones that have those types of resources and those types of organizations versus ones that don't.
And Mike, this is actually a purpose-built question for you, because you guys are in the game of making the connections between startup and large enterprise and getting those startups to where they're enterprise ready and can actually be successful. So what are your thoughts? I mean, you guys have seen a lot over the past 5 years.
Yeah, and we do this every day. So this is a really long topic for discussion. And Brian, agree. We try and be the referee, the one sitting in the middle between completely different worlds. Like a startup has a completely different mindset, a completely different game, as a huge corporation with tons of resources. So we talk to both sides and try and make them be able to do business together. And ultimately, our goals for the corporations to be able to pilot or just do quick pilots to test with the startup, keep an open mind. I think as a corporation, this is of critical importance. Like there's a million examples. Like we have Uber Freight on this webinar, but Uber is an example of disrupting the industry. If you don't pay attention to the startups as a corporation, like you could be in trouble. So it's definitely critically important. As a startup, I really like Daniel's comment as well about as you have to be flexible to the needs of the customer as well. Like, yes, you're right, Brian, like you shouldn't say I'm targeting everyone, but you should also keep an open mind. Like you should have a use case. And then let's say a customer comes to you and says, this is the new use case. I mean, that's the benefit of a startup is they can completely pivot their business model and they can really scale to whatever that corporate partner might need. And yeah, I agree. You need to be careful about the partners you choose. Like you can't just say yes, yes, yes to the corporations, or we've seen a million times where a corporation is completely taking advantage of a startup. It's very difficult. And then my last bit of advice, I'll just kind of echo. I'm just echoing what everyone's saying because there's a lot of good points here. Is that you need to have like these parts of your organization, like procurement, legal, HR, bought into working with startups. Like as a large organization, a lot of times you're used to working with traditional vendors like Microsoft or SAP, whoever, and then it's just going to get shut down. But as a startup, like you need to limit your legal documents, have a smaller MSA to work with these startups, and really keep an open mind to test and pilot. And if it works, then you scale it. But if not, then you just kill it and move on.
It's a really great inputs on that one. And we're going to completely shift gears a little bit here, given that this is a USC sponsored supply chain summit. And I'm actually affiliated with a good supply chain program at the University of Arkansas as well, with national accolades. So we're bound to have people watching this panel that are undergrad and grad students within the supply chain disciplines. And the question there is, what advice as panelists and as industry professionals would we have so that these students can be successful? What kind of skills do they need to pick up? What kind of attitude do they need to have? What sort of businesses do they need to look at? Manish, why don't you lead us off on that? This is really advice to the next generation of supply chain leaders.
Yeah. So I've been working closely with USC, our entire team has, and we're working closely with the master's class for supply chain on certain projects. And then we have internship program as well. It's been really great for all of us because there's great talent and they get to explore what they want to do. So I think a few things I want to highlight is I've come across students who want to take a more traditional path, going into, we talked about procurement, and which is also part of supply chain. So there are more traditional types of jobs. You got to make that choice. And then there are other students who are open to cutting edge innovation, trying new things. So you got to decide what are you comfortable with and take that path. I think the common theme I'd say is part of it is education, but a lot depends on initiative and taking those chances. Networking is big. I mean, these events help. I know, when I was in grad school, I got hooked onto LinkedIn, and I don't think a single day has gone by in the last 20 years that I haven't spent time, at least a few minutes, building the network. And that's important. You don't know when that network is going to come handy. So I think choosing a path, you want to go traditional or disruptive. Building a network is a big piece. And we talked about, hey, do you want to work with a startup or do you want to work with a larger company? Very different culturally. where you get stability with the larger companies. There's higher risk with the smaller companies, but potential faster growth as well. And you get to learn a lot. You get to wear multiple hats. So I think exploring all options and then knowing what you want to, where you want to be in a few years will help you chalk that path towards that.
Oh, that's great. Daniel, thoughts about that? As you look at emerging undergrad and grad students, or those that are thinking about designating something in the supply chain arena as their major course of study, what advice would you have?
Yeah, I think when it comes to like succeeding at tech startups like Uber Freight, a lot of it is really just having a ton of curiosity about the space, right? And not coming with what you think you know about the industry. Obviously, it's so large, it's so complex. I look at all the folks that do quite well at Uber Freight, and it's folks that are coming in kind of like not really understanding the full picture of the industry, but just ask hundreds and hundreds of questions, right? And I think you look at Uber Freight, the business itself is only about 4 years old, and we kind of came in as a new entrant into the freight brokerage space, and we just worked very closely with a lot of enterprise shippers and just asked hundreds and hundreds of questions to just build all these right products. If we're bringing folks onto our team, or if I'm hiring folks, that's kind of always the number one trait that we're looking at, and we've seen that scale pretty well within the organization.
Great. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely a lot of thoughts on this, and there's a lot of opportunities in supply chain. So the folks at USC who chose supply chain to study, it's a great field, and there's a ton of, especially nowadays with COVID, it's a really good field to be in. My advice to the people, the undergrads, is you should really try and find people like within your network, or whether you cold outreach them on LinkedIn or whoever. It's better to get a warm introduction, but to find people actually within the industry to try and build those relationships, learn directly from them, because I feel that there's still a lot of relationships that are very important in this industry. So getting those kind of relationships will help you as you move into this field, but obviously follow the areas of supply chain that you're excited about, that you're passionate about. Like if you're interested in finance, investing in startups or innovation, Plug and Play is a great choice. If you're interested in actually doing the supply chain work, like some of the big supply chain players like MSC or Geodis are really interesting. Or if you're super innovative and you're a risk taker, you should join a startup. But I would say that my biggest advice would be to reach out to people, try and get warm introductions. If you can't get those, get cold introductions or even introductions from USC. And then I would say even offer yourself as an intern for free in the beginning, and say, it depends on which state you're in. You can get in trouble, I think, in California for saying that. But in certain places, you should, offer yourself as an intern and prove your value, because it's hard to take a risk for someone to hire a undergrad a lot of the time. But if you prove your value and you're a hard worker, you can grow a lot in a lot of these companies and get started.
Yeah, internships and gaining that practical knowledge in great companies, large and small, it's really sage advice. Satya, what about you? What advice would you have for these emerging students that are thinking about supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if you're serious about supply chain, you're in it. You're now hearing from somebody who chose that profession or a profession in it when he was 15 years old, back then in Switzerland, right? Now, obviously, it just gave away my age, but I think that's okay. But the point really is, I'm equally excited about it as I was when I started, to be honest with you, because there's just so much in it, right? And I think everybody who just spoke, I mean, is essentially spot on, right? From curiosity, from learning, from seeing different things. What I would say, though, as a recommendation, and we do this also with some interns as well, which works really great for us as well. But when you consider a startup, I think, you have to get off the money thought. Yeah, you're not going to get rich out of the gate. You just have to be clear on that. But what you will do is you're going to get on a different growth and learning acceleration than and sorry when I speak against enterprises, but I think that's just reality. You can learn so much more, so quicker from a smaller team than joining a big team, right? And if you think about it long term, and I know in early 20s you don't like to do that, but if you think about your career is going to last for 40 years, you can easily invest 2-3 years, make less money, but accelerate the growth and the learning curve, right? And join a startup and be in it from a different perspective. So, but first and foremost, I think it's a super great field to be in, no matter where you land. If a startup, which I obviously promote, I think you got to get off the horse with the money thinking. That's how it happened.
Yeah, the bumper sticker there is long hours and low wages for a long time, but you're compressing time in that you're learning so much more if you happen to be in a startup, for sure.
Exactly.
Andre, I want to get you and Brian in on this one as well. Andre, what do you think? What advice would you have to these emerging students?
Well, I think, I think everyone's said some very interesting things. For me, obviously, I'm a bit like Sasha. I've been in this business for about 40 years now, and even though I was on the tech side, I still find it fascinating. I think what's interesting is that if you have to look at the industry as a whole, you have to understand what the industry does. The fact that it enables trade and commercial relationships, and it's about how you get this product from here to there, and what you consume comes from was manufactured somewhere and transported, and so there's this whole excitement and fascination around the industry. Now, I think as a graduate, my recommendation would be obviously to try to join one of the larger companies where perhaps you'll be able to rotate between various departments, gaining experience in the different sectors of the business, and then making your choice as to what it is you're interested in. And I think enthusiasm is very important. Understanding why supply chain, because I think, as somebody mentioned before, it's not a high-paying industry and it's long working hours. Although with digitalization we're going to solve that. But I think that you have to understand, if you work for a shipping company like MSC, you have to understand what it is that you're doing, what it is that you're bringing to the world, and that you're part of a bigger picture.
Brian, couple words from you on this, and then I want to transition to the geopolitical, and I'll have you lead off on that as well. So advice for students as it relates to supply chain.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of great advice here from some really good experts that are in different parts of this ecosystem. And I think that, the one thing I would say from a LinkedIn or a networking perspective is come in, just like you were saying at a startup, come in with the idea of learning versus becoming an employee. If I've got someone that connects with me on LinkedIn and says, hey, I love what you do, I'm interested in that space, I'd love to learn more about it, can you help give me advice? Can you tell me something about the organization, whatever? I'm always open to do those kind of things. Versus if someone just says, hey, do you have a job for me, right? Or at least is having that more direct push of a job. You got a much better chance of actually getting a job by coming in with a learning mindset, because I'll see you, I'll understand what you can bring to the value to my organization or to a colleague that I know is looking for a really smart young student coming out of grad school or coming out of your undergraduate. I would also say, if you're like Andre and Sasha and came at this from the very beginning, myself, I come from a science background, so I'm kind of an oddball. But if you do come at it from the very beginning, get into programs like USC or Harvey Mudd or MIT or these organizations that have these pilot programs internally where they get to do projects with enterprises. I've done a few of those myself with students across the United States, and those are mutually beneficial, and there's no better way to build your education in supply chain or your network than working as a young undergrad or grad student with these organizations. So I think those are just some of the ways that you can kind of step in stone or even leapfrog your way into an organization.
Brian, I want to stay with you on this, and we'll treat this as a bit of a lightning round because we're down to about our last 5 minutes. And this is unfair because this question we could have spoken for an entire hour on. But given that the geopolitical issues that we see between particularly the US and China as it relates to tariffs and supply chain issues during the COVID-19 and whatnot, what do you see as both opportunities and risk as it relates to supply chain innovation as you look at that somewhat adversarial relationship between the US and China now?
Yeah, well, I'm going to say two words that were probably on our drinking list and I missed them, but resilience and flexibility. So I think that it's not just China. It could be China, the US, it could be China, the Europe, Brexit, right? There's all of these things. There's even, NAFTA and others that are continually changing, and some seem to pop up out of nowhere. So I think the flexibility built into your supply chain, and maybe it's China plus one, maybe it's nearshoring or reshoring. I think those three topics are going to become more and more prevalent in our industry, and it's going to be less of just looking for the lowest cost, although the consumer will define that, right? If we try to reshore things, we try to or nearshore things, and all of a sudden the pricing goes up, the consumer is going to tell you if that was the right decision or not pretty quick.
Right.
So I think those things to build your resilient, flexible supply chain are going to be critical in these geopolitical or pandemic issues that pop up.
Andre, what about you? I know you've got a global and international perspective. What do you think? The U.S. and China are butting heads. What are your thoughts?
You know, I'm only the techie here, so no, I think that you know, companies are looking at diversification, the manufacturing processes, you know, lower risk countries. Of course, as a container line, we have to follow the market, as we say, and I think we're definitely, if we look at the environment, it's become more conducive to operating on intra-Asia routes, and we've, you know, introduced all sorts of new services, including during the COVID. So we tend to follow the market. So I'm not being a politician. I won't comment on my personal opinion, but yes, I think that it's a global world. It's a global world, and there's competition the same way there's competition within businesses. Got it.
Sasha, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's a huge opportunity to build that resilient supply chain, as Brian indicated, and to actually go about it with a lot of speed too, because we just have to. Yeah, so that's the opportunity. I do believe, though, there are challenges on hand. I mean, cyber security is just one of them that especially us on the tech side need to be very mindful. And then I think the other item is, you know, is tech really globally deployable everywhere in the same speed? You know, there are challenges out there, of course, going back to China as it relates to tech rollout, because you're just limited in a few ways than maybe other parts in the world. So I think opportunity and the certainly very prominent challenges I see in those two items. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm going to try to get the last three of you in on real quick comments here. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sounds, I'll try and go really quick, but yeah, resiliency I think is key. The other thing that I've noticed with technology and we believe in is that technology can come anywhere in the world. So always keep an open mind. I do think like China, as we discussed, is a very different market. It's a different world. But I mean, we look globally, we look in startups in China. Sometimes it's hard to get them out of China, but there's definitely challenges. You just have to be aware of them and always willing to adapt when needed.
Perfect. Daniel.
Yeah, and I think the word's been said quite a bit of times already, right? And it's just, you just keep having this imperative need for resiliency. And I think for me, it's whenever there's any uncertainty, there's an opportunity for innovation. And, you know, with all the commotion that's definitely going on, it's just more and more imperative for folks to adopt to different innovations.
Perfect. Manish, land the plane for us. You get the final comment.
Okay, I want to draw attention for those who attended the keynote session today that Nick led and the Dean of the Business School from USC talked about. It was fascinating, some of the data that they shared. 2 years ago, the massive impact on China in terms of the trade with the US, you can see the graphs just dropping. And the expectation was that all those jobs will come to the US, but there's different effects. What they shared was Vietnam, for example, and some of the other Asian countries have picked up, and Mexico has picked up rapidly as well. And they shared how it might be cheaper to produce in Mexico, the total landed cost overall. So I'm predicting, and I'm hearing from them as well, it's going to be a massive shift of the supply chain out of China into other places. Some of that coming back domestic manufacturing wise. So it's going to be an exciting next few years to keep up with all that.
You all have been a fantastic panel. We're actually out of time. I wanted to let everybody know that's watching that there's a plenary panel in the main auditorium after this session. Listen, thanks everybody for attending. You panelists were very engaging. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope the audience enjoyed it. This is a great program, and everybody look forward to the 9th summit next year. I think you'll a lot of good learning, a lot of good education, a lot of good contacts. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks
Jeff.
for
Thanks for
hosting.
hosting.
Cheers.